first, we'll be recording the session. So if you'd rather stay off video or listen to the recording later, please do whatever is most comfortable for you. The second thing, please do go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, and where you're joining from, so we can get a feel for who's in our virtual room today. And finally, if you're not a presenter, please stay on mute until the Q&A so we can all hear what our amazing panelists have to say with the greatest clarity possible. I'm Amy Jo Dowd. I'm the head of evidence at the LEGO Foundation, and I'm very proud to be co-hosting this session with Donica Namoska, the Chief Knowledge Officer at the Jacobs Foundation. Both of our organizations, like the Global Partnership for Education, believe in education system transformation, and that to meet the challenge of the 21st century, we need to work with governments to set foundations for lifelong learning early by expanding high quality opportunities for children to learn through play, exploration, and iteration to ensure that they have the breadth of skills that they need for the future. At the LEGO Foundation, we believe skills measurement is so important, we have an initiative focused on it, through which we aim to work with and learn from in-country experts to contextualize holistic skills measurement tools to inform our decisions. This session today is very timely because we're finalizing a systematic review on the contribution of playful and innovative pedagogies to holistic development. The findings show strong links to cognitive learning, but less clear links to social emotional learning because we don't often have contextualized, feasible, and reliable tools to measure it. Given this and the pandemic-driven concern for understanding and supporting children's social and emotional development, we see a clear need for such tools to enable governments to monitor and address the range of skills, including literacy and numeracy, that are fundamental to children's learning and thriving. At the LEGO Foundation, we truly believe that working together will maximize the impact we have and that we all want to see to achieve SDG 4, children receiving quality education and learning. Collaboration can look very different, from co-funding in the education space with other donors to working closely with partners to share knowledge and experiences like we are today through this side event. And that's why I'm very excited to introduce today's panelists. We have John Mugo of the Zizi Afrique Foundation, Nikit Dessa of the Global Center for Development of the Whole Child at the University of Notre Dame. We have Pauline Rose from the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Center at Cambridge University. Adele Pushparatnam of the Global Knowledge and Innovation Unit of the Education Global Practice at the World Bank, Andrew Cunningham from the Aga Khan Foundation, and Sarah Richardson of the Surveys and International Assessments Department of the Australian Council for Education Research. Now, our format today, we will begin with a five-minute introduction from each panelist as to the why, what, and how of their work in expanding the measurement of holistic skills. Then we'll have our lightning round of inputs on the barriers that they experience in this work, after which my co-host Donica from the Jacobs Foundation will offer their perspective, and we'll draw up the themes from the panelists and a few questions to start off our discussion. As all of our panelists present, do feel free to type in questions in the chat, and when we get to the Q&A, you can come off of mute and join the conversation if you'd like to. So without further ado, John, you get the first 5-minute slot onto the why, what, and how of your work measuring holistic skills. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be connecting with you and sharing with you our story of the assessment of life skills and values in East Africa, ALIVE. I am the Executive Director of the Zizi Afrique Foundation. We work from Nairobi, but partnering with around 25 other organizations across East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania specifically, to implement an ambitious 3-year project called the Assessment of Life Skills and Values in East Africa, ALIVE. So why ALIVE? When you look at our 3 countries, there is recognition that socio-emotional learning competences are critical for the success of Africa's children. We are coming from a background of measuring and pushing for foundational competences of literacy and numeracy, specifically our work in UWEZO, and also now at the PAL network, has been limited largely to the academic competences. Yet, when you look at unemployment rates across the continent, you look at where the future is headed and the competitiveness of Africa, we are convinced that it is socio-emotional competencies such as problem solving, communicating, collaborating, and working with others that will matter most also to the competitiveness of sub-Saharan African children. So this combined with the fact that outcomes have been very low, even in academic outcomes, that on average only around a third of children, less than a third actually, are learning at a grade level. Then the thinking that social-emotional learning competences could actually come and act as scaffolds even for academic learning and other areas of learning outcomes. So this, we have a level of recognition in our education systems that these competencies are important, and varied integration in our curricula across the 3 countries. In Kenya, for instance, the new curriculum, competence-based curriculum, defines 7 core competencies that include aspects like collaboration, creativity and innovation, problem solving and critical thinking, and others. And when you look at Uganda and Tanzania, also we have varied measures of integration of these competencies. So, but then when you look at the measurements that exist on the continent, most of them, if not all, are defined and developed for other contexts and only adapted to the African context. So that's why we thought this was timely and we trusted ourselves to do something. So what are we doing? What we are doing is this assessment of life skills and values. Life skills and values is our interpretation of socio-emotional learning, of soft skills, of 21st century skills. We felt these are the concepts that are well understood in our context and that we should use, because the issue is not what you call them, but what they are. So we have started this journey as 25 organizations across the 3 countries and bringing on board others under the umbrella of the Regional Education Learning Initiative, RELI. And 6 things that I can mention. One is contextualization, that we are understanding this construct in our context and getting out to measure them. Open source tool is what we are aiming for, that by the end of this all, we'll have an open source tool that we could share with the rest of the world. We are starting at the household, because it is at the household where we can get all adolescents. And here we are talking about adolescents aged 13 to 17 years, and focusing on 4 competencies of problem solving, of self-awareness, collaboration. And we are trying also to see whether we could assess 1 value, respect. Then we are going to, after we have the evidence, use it for 2 ways. One is the pathway of influencing system change, informing policies, especially for implementing pathways to nurturing these competencies in our children, but also public awareness so that parents and youth and teachers would understand these concepts and competencies in context. And then learning capacities, improving ourselves and forming a learning community that is working with over 100 people meeting and learning on how to do this. And then voice, in terms of representing Africa's voice on the global stage on what these competencies mean for our context and how to measure them. So we are moving now through a 34-week process of developing the tool with an external facilitator and all of us with government officers involved. And this pathway is now around the 19th week. So by around the end of this year, we shall have the tool developed. Then in 2022, we are moving to assess and engage the system around this. So we are here to share the story.
Great time, John.
The story around it, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right, our second panelist is Nikit Desa. Nikit, take it away.
Thanks, Imja. So where to start? So I'll start 5 years ago. I was working with colleagues from Save the Children. We were working in a refugee camp in Jordan for primarily Syrian refugee children. And we were working together to develop a measure for social emotional learning skills for these children to help the facilitators and the programmers in the camp understand how children's social emotional learning skills were changing. And so one of the skills that we had focused on and that we were focusing on was self-concept. And so we used a very well-validated international measure of self-concept that had been used widely in many different places. And it didn't work for us really well. Children had a hard time understanding the items that were in the measure. They had a hard time understanding the response options. And so the reliabilities and validities of this measure were not where we'd like it to be. So we ended up talking to some teachers and facilitators who were working with the children. And what we understood was that the way we were defining kind of self-concept, which was kind of children's general ability to understand themselves and their own attributions and their own skills and their place in their community, was different from how the teachers were talking about kind of self-concept and what the children were doing. What they were talking about was that the children were really struggling with just having kind of aspirations for the future, knowing what they could even do 3 years, 2 years down the line. And so what they were really talking about was this idea of kind of future orientation. So when they talked about self-concept, they were really talking about this idea of future orientation, children being able to understand kind of where they were going to go in the future. And so we used that information, and what we designed was a performance-based measure where we asked children to imagine some kind of future for themselves, a year, 2 years, 5 years down the line, and draw a picture of it. And then we'd ask them questions about that picture. Can you tell me one thing that would stop you from getting to this future? One thing that could help you getting to this future? And what we saw was that children really liked that kind of tactile performance-based measure, but also the reliability and validity of what we were getting was much stronger than other measures that we'd used previously. And so there were kind of three main lessons that we took away from this. One was that there are a lot of measures for children's social emotional learning. A lot of them have been developed, as John pointed out, in high resource contexts, and they could be used in other contexts as well, but they need a lot of time to be adapted, and resources need to be put into adapting them appropriately. But sometimes even when we adapt them, the dimensions of those skills that are being focused on in some measure aren't matched to the dimensions of the skills that are important in that context. The second thing is that there's a lot of knowledge in teachers and community members and parents that isn't being used sufficiently to understand how these skills are prioritized, how they matter, how they're defined, how they're used by children in these different contexts that they're living in. And the third thing was that a lot of the work around, especially social emotional skills, is putting right now the onus on children. Children building these social emotional skills. Children are responsible for kind of leveraging and building these skills. But if we take that example from Jordan, the restrictions that were put on children in the camp affected how they could use those skills, where they could use them, and what skills they could even develop. And so those three things have really affected kind of the trajectory of work that we're on now, trying to understand kind of the context-specific nature of skills, using the discourse that community members and parents have into the development of skills, and also understanding what systems around children affect the way they use these social emotional learning skills. And so one of the projects that we're working on is in partnership with USAID. It's called the SHARE activity, where we're working in several different countries. We're starting in Honduras, Haiti, and Liberia right now, where we're going to be working with the education ecosystems there.
1 minute.
Thanks, Amija. To actually develop an ethnographic process where we use the discourse of parents, teachers, and communities to develop an actual measure for social emotional learning. At the same time, we're using kind of a parallel track in those three countries to use the same method to develop a measure for teacher well-being. So using teachers' own discourse of the assets that they need to understand how teachers understand their own well-being. So what we're trying to do is develop a process where education ecosystems can develop their own kind of context-specific measure or adapt measures for both social emotional learning and teacher well-being, so that we can start understanding not just children's context-specific social emotional learning, but also other systems and actors around children and how they might actually affect children's social emotional learning. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nikaj. Pauline, you're up next.
Thanks. And I guess just to start by saying, I think like others on this panel, the answer to the why is because like others, we share the passion that education is more than just about academic skills, important as they are, And so the socio-emotional learning aspect is as vital. And I think, Nikita, as you were saying, this isn't about sort of children's own responsibility to it, but really about how schools are or can support children's socio-emotional learning. The role of teachers in it, but also recognizing teachers themselves need support. So I think it's sort of really about trying to unpack a lot of this. In terms of more specifically the why, we have been working on the RISE research program that some of you might be familiar with, the Research for Improving Systems for Education, with colleagues in Ethiopia, so led by the Addis Ababa University and the Ethiopian Policy Studies Institute and a number of different partners. And from the outset, we were concerned about making sure that we included socio-emotional learning as part of this analysis. It's a huge program for those that you know it, and it's sort of, sometimes a challenge to really keep the focus. So we were really excited when we were having discussions with Lego Foundation about how we might expand this focus, in particular, given the really important context of the current pandemic of COVID-19 and the fact that this might be having effects on children's socio-emotional learning alongside the other aspects of academic learning. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment about learning loss, but that learning loss is usually about numeracy and literacy. So obviously there was sort of quite a tight timescale to work within to try and develop our work to really sort of see what the effects were as a result of the COVID-19 school closures in Ethiopia. So we had the benefit of already having collected data previously, and we collected more data and also extended our sort of understanding and notions of socio-emotional learning, including also mental health and well-being as part of it. Our very initial headline message is that socio-emotional learning has indeed declined. So we're sort of at the moment got a draft paper, and my colleague Stephen Bailey is here, who's been leading on this together with our colleagues, as I said, in Ethiopia. But we're trying to sort of unpack some of the dimensions and interactions. So as I said, we're looking at socio-emotional learning from the context of a number of different areas of looking at scales related to social skills, so self-efficacy, emotional regulation, and also adding in the connection with mental health and well-being, which are separate but very much related. And we've been collecting quantitative data on this. We've also used the World Bank Teach tool, and I think Adele, you might be speaking about this in a moment, so I won't go into details on it. So that's looking at classroom practices in relation to socio-emotional learning, to see actually what's happening within the classroom setting as well. And just to say as an aside, we've also used this in Rwanda quite successfully, so we were quite keen to see how it would work in Ethiopia. So I'm building on, Nick, what you were saying about how best to go about this. We had quite a lot of debate about how best to get children's perspectives. These were primary school age children, perspectives on socio-emotional learning. And we went through different options, and thank you, we have really helpful discussions with you as well in developing our tools. And we decided in collaboration with our colleagues in Ethiopia that for this particular work, using self-reported scales was the best way to go. We drew on existing measures, but adapted them, and we reviewed extensively what we could find in relation to ones that have been used in related contexts and for related age groups. And we some of them we decided weren't, particularly our colleagues in Ethiopia decided weren't relevant for the context. Some of them had to be adapted. Yeah, and some of them had to be adapted. The wording might not have been right, etc. And we had to do that a further round of that as they were translated into local languages as well, because some might have worked in some Ethiopian languages, but not all of them. So there was another iteration. So I finished, thanks.
I think right as Pauline finished there, we had a little blip in the recording, but it seems like it's up and going again. Thank you so much, Pauline. Adele, you're up next.
All right, perfect. Well, hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. So to begin with the first question of why we're working on expanding holistic skills measurement here at the World Bank. First, I think most importantly, it's because what gets measured gets done. And in other words, monitoring and tracking data on a particular outcome of interest really makes it more likely that that outcome of interest will be prioritized within a given program or intervention. And the reason why I think it's important to prioritize holistic skills is because I think this will help education systems improve education service delivery as a whole. I think a key message within this agenda needs to be that even if an education system wants to focus solely on academic skills, which should not be the case, ensuring that the system nurtures children's holistic development makes it more likely that it will achieve the outcomes that it wants to see in terms of academic skills. And I think this echoes back to what John was saying earlier about that scaffolding of the academic skills. And I think also relates to what Pauline was saying in terms of what we're seeing in learning losses. When we talk about recuperating those learning losses, you can't really have that conversation without also thinking about how to support teachers and students holistically and not just on the content side. So what we're doing to expand this, the role that I'm in at the World Bank is focused on supporting task teams or regional teams in dialogue with education policymakers. So here I have the opportunity to help teams drive country dialogue on the importance of thinking about skills holistically, and also by providing them with tools to support the measurement of holistic skills. And by driving this dialogue and providing teams with the tools, the hope is that we'll also be able to contribute to the knowledge base on how to measure skills holistically across the globe and how to measure them well in a way that's contextually relevant and appropriate. My work focuses on two key areas. One is in early childhood, and the second on teachers and teacher professional development, and how I'm approaching that within those themes. First, within early childhood, my team and I have been working on supporting teams and counterparts to measure early childhood developmental outcomes at scale. And here we've ensured that the tool that we've developed based on analysis of data from 12 low and middle income countries, the AIM ECD, is targeted at children aged 4 to 6. And we've made sure that that tool captures pre-literacy and pre-numeracy skills, but also aspects of development such as social emotional skills and executive functioning. And this tool has both a direct assessment element and a caregiver report module as part of it. On the side of teachers, as Pauline already alluded to, we've been supporting teams to capture the quality of teaching practices in the classroom. One key piece of this has been the development and rollout of the Teach Classroom Observation tools, which includes a focus on the extent to which teachers nurture social emotional skills in the classroom. And we've also recently revised the original Teach tool to strengthen its focus on inclusive teaching practices. Teach is currently available at the primary and ECE levels, with Teach Secondary ready for piloting soon. And this is work that we've also been doing with Pauline in Rwanda, as she mentioned. I also wanted to mention here that in this work with Teach, something that we've been trying to address as well is what we call the implementation gap. And often what we see is that programs focus on the design of programs to make sure that they focus on social emotional skills, and then on the outcomes of, okay, did this program result in the social emotional learning or the holistic skills that we intended. But importantly, I think that we're hoping that the Teach tool will also help to capture some of that process to really understand, okay, is the design translating into what's actually happening on the ground? And then how can we improve what's happening on the ground so that we can get to the intended outcomes that we're looking for? So process quality is something that we focus on a lot within our work. And while not specifically related to measurement, I thought I would also mention here briefly the work that we're doing on Coach, which is a program focused on improving teacher professional development. And that includes an emphasis on holistic learning as well. And this I wanted to mention because it ties back to the idea that I put on the table earlier of what gets measured gets done. And what we're seeing is that if there's concrete data on whether or not teaching practices that happen in the classroom are those that nurture holistic development, it is then easier to drive forward the dialogue on the importance of supporting teachers or putting in place interventions and programs that do promote that holistic skill development. And I am done with 1 minute to spare.
Wow, thank you so much. All the more time for discussion. All right, take it away, Andrew. I think you're sharing your screen. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just to make holistic learning outcomes actually come alive, I'm a bit more of a visual learner. So I just have a few slides that go along with the why, the what, and the how. And I just want to begin with why the Aga Khan Foundation has cared about this over the last 4 decades. It's at the heart of our education goal of equipping children and young people, not just with the knowledge and skills, but with the attitudes and values to interact effectively with the world and become contributing members of society. And when we look at that in a visual way, we view holistic learning outcomes as multidimensional, interconnected, and dynamic. So when we say the knowledge, the skills, the values, and attitudes, we had to work across the different research consortia, our different countries, to actually identify and narrow down, I can't believe I'm saying narrow when I see the number 27 learning domains but to view each learning domain perhaps as a cube, where each of the side is a shared responsibility by students, teachers, school leaders, family members, community members, and government leaders, but to view these domains as not just interconnected and multidimensional, but dynamic. And that's what's one of the greatest opportunities, but also the challenges of moving this work forward. So in terms of our what, we are thrilled to be joined by a group of foundations around the world, but also 10 national advisory committees that are co-chaired by the ministries of education to work with 1,000 government schools, preschools, primary schools, and secondary schools over the next 10 years to enable teachers to be able to assess, design, and showcase what works across these quality learning domains. And we are very excited because we began with the 27 domains at the beginning of the project. And over this last year, even against the odds of COVID-19, in each one of our countries, our teams have led a human-centered design process with local stakeholders to identify which 5 learning domains are most important at each one of the age groups, at the pre-primary, the primary, and secondary level, that they are lacking not just the assessment tools, but most importantly, the assessment tools that can inform new, contextually relevant, actionable, and classroom level solutions that work. And we'll share these slides because I don't expect you to memorize all these right away. But you can see the different groupings and the different relevance across also the speakers that have already presented the tools that are being developed from the country and regions themselves. And so I want to leave us with a so what, is connecting the holistic learning measurement with holistic pedagogical approaches. So this to us, first step of 6 that teachers can use to not only assess these different levels of learning outcomes, but then move into a design thinking phased approach where they're collaborating with diverse stakeholders to develop or to adapt or to adopt existing solutions in their context through flexible funding support from this consortium of donors, then to track, iterate, and ultimately showcase what works. And that for us, there are some other colleagues on the call from Oxford Measured, one of our great partners globally, but also from across our different countries, as each country also has a national assessment partner. And we're very much looking forward to presenting the first suite of tools that were developed in each one of these countries as rapid learning assessment tools that were developed from the countries and to be presented just in September at UPFIAT. So thanks for letting a little bit of the visual learning come into play, and also thrilled about making these synergies across our different efforts more practical and relevant and ultimately useful for teachers in our respective classrooms. So thanks, Amy, over to you.
Perfect. Coming in again under 5 minutes. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. I've obviously got a challenge here to meet the 5-minute mark. So as you mentioned at the beginning, I work for the Australian Council for Educational Research. And as many of you will know, we do a lot of work on assessment. And I noticed in one of Andy's slides that literacy and numeracy were the top 2 areas of measurement that almost every country picked. We're currently doing some work on curiosity and creativity. And I think as an assessment organization, what's been quite interesting is that we are very explicitly avoiding the word assessment and instead using the word evidencing. So we're working with the International Baccalaureate, which has programs offered in 159 countries and for students aged between the ages of 3 and 19. So the scope is absolutely enormous. With funding from Jacobs Foundation and from the IB, we're looking at, we initially started thinking about, can we have a transcript that stands alongside an academic transcript so that learners can evidence their achievement in non-academic domains? And this fits in very well. The why in the IB programs are very much about nurturing the whole learner, nurturing the whole person. So using curiosity and creativity as two exemplar areas, the process that we followed is that which we would follow in literacy, numeracy, science type assessments. Really engaging with the literature, looking at the latest research, thinking very carefully about definitions. And I think when we talk about 21st century skills, one of the challenges and one of the interesting elements is that there's a lack of agreement, there's a lack of centralized agreement on what the constructs actually are. And that can pose challenges for measurement. So we did a lot of consultation, and we actually brought together some of the top experts in the world on those areas with some top educators to really have a debate over what we could aim for. And I think that as the project has moved on, our thinking has really been challenged in a way that we've really turned around what we're focusing on. So instead of thinking about how can we measure curiosity and creativity amongst learners, what we're thinking more about is how can a school evaluate the extent to which it provides a nurturing environment for creativity and curiosity. We've questioned the extent to which constructs such as creativity and curiosity are state or trait, or a bit of both. The extent to which they're skills or attributes. Are we actually measuring something that someone does, or are we thinking about an attitude? How would we approach that? And so we've reached a point now where we've come up with some frameworks that define these things, but we've also done a lot of consultations with teachers in schools all around the world. They've been very positive about the work that we've done in defining, but all of them have said, please don't put me in a position to judge someone's creativity or their curiosity. So we've come up with a sort of thermometer model where learners are able to recognize that we are naturally as individuals more curious or more creative in certain situations than in others. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But in order to evidence our curiosity or our creativity, it's about thinking of the sum of experiences and outputs that we've created through a learning cycle, and then reflecting on them. How have I been able to evidence my creativity or curiosity? One more minute. And for teachers, the emphasis is very much on how can teachers scaffold some of the underlying skills. Our colleagues at the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment are doing a parallel study where they are actually looking at promising practices in how teachers can do this. So I think really just to sum up, we've moved very much from a position of thinking about curiosity and creativity in the way that we would about a standard academic area, right the way through to thinking, okay, this is about how can learners reflect, how can teachers scaffold, but also recognizing that constructs such as curiosity and creativity are not, it's not like learning science. These are elements that will wax and wane, and being able to observe that within yourself is going to enhance your metacognitive development. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you so much. Now, as we hear this wide range of different skills and ways that our colleagues that have presented are thinking about them, one of the things I wanted to take some time to do next is to really sort of focus in on some of the barriers, which have been mentioned in some of the hows, I do believe so far, but I've challenged our panelists to give us a single word about the biggest barrier that they're facing to date, as well as a sentence to explain it, if it's not explanatory in and of itself in the single word. So we're going to go backwards. So actually, Sarah, I'm going to ask you to come off mute again and give us your input on that.
Yeah, so it's absolutely the fact that there is no generalized agreement on the constructs. When we're talking about something like creativity or collaboration, what is that? And until we can define what it is, it's very difficult to measure it. And this is why we're taking a very careful approach, being very consultative and very cautious.
Awesome, thank you. Andrew, how about you? Biggest barrier?
I think 3 words: absence of teachers. I think when we
Say-
think about so much money, so much time, so much effort, and then we try to bring teachers in and say, isn't this useful? I think we can all understand that perhaps some teachers up in some rural areas of northern Pakistan or some remote areas in many other places around the world, they may not have the word grit in terms of a measurement tool, but they would be able to describe some of their girls and boys demonstrating grit beyond our belief. So I think absence of teachers is the greatest barrier in this work right now.
Thank you so much. Adele, how about in your work?
So agreeing with the two words that have already been shared, and also I would say integration. So not treating social emotional or holistic learning as something separate from academic learning, but really showing how the two are necessary to move in parallel.
Thanks so much. Pauline.
Yep, to add to those ones, context. So I think, when we're trying to get data, understand what's happening, understand the sort of both what's happening in the classroom, what's happening with the teachers, etc., and the students themselves, it really varies across context. So trying to get a one size fits all is really quite difficult. So I think when we're sort of thinking about numeracy, it's not entirely straightforward, but maybe a little bit more straightforward of how to sort of get some measures. So the PAL network's done a great job, for example, on very simple measures to try and assess numeracy across different contexts. I think it's much more difficult, both what it is we're trying to measure, but also how to go about it. So some of these approaches of vignettes and photo voice, etc., can work well in some contexts, but maybe not in others. So really thinking about that as well. I just wanted to say there's a good word in the chat as well from Charles on which has confusion. So I'm not sure. Hopefully, Amy Jo, by the end of this session, you'll have addressed that one.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Nikit, how about you? What's your word for the biggest barrier?
My word would be feasibility. I think right now when we think about measures for any of this, there's a lot of focus on reliability, right? Are we measuring the same thing again and again in the same way? There's a little less maybe, but some focus on validity, like are we measuring the right thing? But there isn't enough focus on feasibility. How do we actually do this? How much does it cost? How much time does it take to do this in a valid and reliable way? And I think we really need to move that needle if we actually want this to be taken up in a larger scale.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And John, last but not least.
Yes, local capacities. When you look at the assessments that exist globally, Africa is hardly represented. So we are looking for a process of developing local capacities rapidly through a process, because unlike academic competencies that are largely universal, these kind of constructs require also a lot of context relevance. And only people like us who are working here, who belong here, can contribute also immensely to the understanding and development of measurement. So we have 45 of us through the life process, working together collaboratively over a period of time to rapidly develop our own capacities to engage with the rest of the world.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So now we have a view of the why, the what, and the how of these 6 panelists and their colleagues across their organizations and many partners, it sounds like. I'm now going to turn over to Donica, who will present a little bit of the Jacobs Foundation perspective on the topic, and then also some themes, and start off our Q&A. Donica, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks so much, Joe. Well, I don't know if I would be able to summarize what was an incredibly rich panel and even starting discussion, but maybe let me say a few words about what the Jacobs Foundation's view on all of this is and our perspective, and then I'll attempt at pulling out a few of the kind of overarching themes and then put it back to the panelists with a few starting questions. So first off, in terms of the Jacobs Foundation's work, we really approached the question of holistic skills measurement from the perspective of how can we create learning ecosystems that enable all children to thrive together. And how do we do that? By recognizing children's specific needs, strengths, vulnerabilities, and designing learning environments and experiences that are enabling the acquisition of skills, knowledge, mindsets that are critical for success in school and in life. So from that end, we're approaching the issue of measurement systems for holistic skills as a critical element that can empower transformational change to enable whole child development and more accurately reflect what is actually happening and at the individual or at the development of each child. And this is guided by the notion that by better understanding the individual pathway of children and how children learn best, we can create the enabling conditions for holistic skills that are built into the settings and contexts in which children grow and learn. And over the next 10 years, we'll be embarking on that journey. We just launched our strategy 2030, which will be examining all of these facets of child learning and development with a focus on learning variability by supporting pioneering new research on the topic, enabling the translation of research into practice, and then working in several key geographies to support transformational change at a systemic level. And we're excited to be working with many of you here to support all of your wonderful work that you're doing, and look forward to working with many others over the next 10 years. In terms of the common things I heard, just very briefly, maybe summarizing a few things using that why, what, how framework. So at the why level, what I heard, there is a high level of alignment in terms of holistic skills really supporting education systems to improve education delivery as a whole, and nurturing both the academic, the literacy, numeracy side of things, but also that broader holistic view. So it's not one or the other, but it's really looking at it from both perspectives. And how do we create a narrative actually around that? How do we move away from that polarizing debate that's going on in the world right now of, is it numeracy and literacy only, or is it holistic skills? Is that a useful debate even to be having? It's a question, I suppose, for all of us to ponder. Then on the what, it struck me that there is a wide range of the kinds of skills that we're all looking at in terms of curiosity, creativity, and several others from within the frameworks that you're all developing. And how do we pull it all together? What does it all mean for all of us in terms of the kinds of different skills that we're all looking at from within the holistic skills perspective? And then on the how, there are a number of different frameworks being developed that are highly contextually relevant and actionable, and it's exciting to see how much work is actually happening in the space. And again, I think the question here is, which many of you brought up too, I think on the feasibility, local capacity, and really how do we put this into practice, and how do governments use these things so that they can use them in a meaningful way to organize their learning ecosystems. So these are all big questions, and maybe I'll start with, we'll just pick on a couple of those and get the panelists' view on them. But in terms of maybe just this debate that's happening now in global education, what are your views on how do we bring it all together? I mean, is there a need for a broader narrative on this topic where we're not really bifurcating it and are creating a more holistic narrative around this? I mean, what are your views on that, of what is needed to move forward so we're not getting stuck in this kind of perhaps unnecessary debate? And then secondly, maybe on the practicalities of how these tools can be contextualized, and where does the government play a role in all of this? I mean, what are the strategies that we can use to make sure that whatever we develop collectively is actually used and applied within national education systems? And what's that pathway for uptake? So maybe, Joe, I don't know how you suggest we do this, but I'm happy to throw these two questions out there and see if anyone will attempt
Absolutely.
reflection on them.
For sure. Let's start. Panelists, whoever wants to raise your hand, and let's see who wants to tackle the unnecessary debate or the strategies questions that Donica's posed. Sarah's got her hands up. I can't see the other panelists. Not all of you. I guess John, shoot me a message if you want to respond. because you're not on video any longer. I assume it's because of bandwidth. So go for it, Sarah.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that. Thank you, Donica. I think those were some really good points. Look, we have to fundamentally think about what the purpose of education is. We're trying to equip young people for their future lives. And we need to think about what's that going to mean. We want and we need them to be able to solve problems, to work together with people in different countries, to be creative, to be curious. And I think the notion that there's a dichotomy that it's either maths or creativity is really flawed. You know, when sometimes when we talk to teachers, it's like, oh, do I have to teach them to be curious as well? It's like, no. It's about the approach to how you go about teaching. And I think that's a really key question here. Is I'm a former teacher myself, and we need to recognize that teachers can create an enabling environment, but there are many things that are beyond their control. And I think when we're talking about social and emotional skills and holistic skills development, we mustn't forget that it's not just teachers, it's families, it's communities. And so I think, you know, we can ask teachers to provide some scaffolding, we can ask teachers to provide an enabling environment, but it takes, you know, the whole community to raise a child. And when we're talking about holistic skills, we must, you know, take into account the fact that teachers, it's not about what teachers are doing necessarily in class. There are many other factors involved as well.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Andy, I see your hand. Why don't you take a crack at them?
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Sarah, for those reflections. I think I was just drawing myself back even a year and a quarter ago when everyone was searching for free open source resources to help families be able to continue simply caring for their kids and somehow teaching them some new things along the way when teachers were completely separated. Now that was, of course, in most of the developed country contexts, where in many of the developing country contexts, that's still the case and has always been the case. And I think one area of bringing it all together, but also engaging government systems, is calling a spade and, you know, making more free and open source resources that teachers can steal, that teachers themselves can try, that teachers themselves can also upload and perhaps then diversify our opportunities for then bringing in the academy to help it become more rigorous and to become more valid, become more reliable. But that first step of just inspiring a teacher in terms of being able to say it's feasible, borrowing some words from the panel, and it's contextualized, and it's free. And it's been done before, maybe by a peer or maybe by myself, and I'm uploading it for others. I think trying to imagine what that kind of open source library looks like for the ministers themselves to also be able to understand, wow, that really was working, to have that linkage between the academic and non-academic. And I hate even those terms themselves, but that's the discourse. But also they themselves don't have to then constantly do another RFP, which is the same group of actors competing for the same constructs. And I think that is what we need to be really driving for, and actually putting the teachers and the educators, as you said, Sarah, the families and communities in that equal setting around that decision-making, not just table, but maybe decision-making underneath the decision-making tree.
So we have a Rubik's Cube and a decision-making tree. And he's all about metaphors today. Other panelists want to weigh in?
Sure.
You're coming off mute. Go for it.
I can go. So I don't know, Donica, if I'm actually going to address your questions directly. I'll try to. But as I think about your question, and especially thinking about what Sarah was saying, I'm thinking of two things. One is kind of alignment, and the second is thinking about alternate systems. And so I think one of the things that Sarah mentioned is, and I worry about constantly in this work, is, are we asking too much of teachers? Are we asking them to just do too much and continue to like add to their plate of things to do? And can we think of ways to think of alignment in the broader systems surrounding children? So one example that comes to mind, and I'll talk about kind of work in Haiti because that's where we're doing a lot of work right now, is within innovation communities trying to align child development messages across the different systems that are working with children. So that's with pre-K teachers, with parents, but even with parish priests and lay parishioners who might be working directly with children. Can we embed the same kind of child development messages in these different systems and actually align that in a way so that they're feeding into each other? So that it's not all falling on a pre-K teacher, but also the responsibility is spread out. And so maybe going back to kind of Andy's presentation of kind of that Rubik's Cube of touching systems, like how do we align that? I think that's where that alignment piece needs to come into play. And the other, I think, is thinking about kind of alternate systems. Going back to kind of the example from Haiti, the Ministry of Education provides probably education to about 11 to 12% of children in Haiti. The Catholic education system provides education to about 20% of children. So thinking about what are the alternate systems that might be affecting children's lives and how do we work within those systems as well. I think there is a lot of importance in focusing on kind of ministries of education and national education systems, but there are local education settings and systems as well, especially in crisis and conflict affected settings, that we need to be leveraging a lot better in this work that we do.
Thanks so much, Nikit. Other panelists want to address Donica's first questions around the unnecessary clarification?
John's hand is up. Would you like to
go for it, John? Sorry, I can't see it somehow. I've been searching.
No worries.
Yeah. Thanks. I think, Donica, your question around pathways to change for the system is very critical, because we acknowledge that as a civil society or as development partners, we'll not be able to push as much as government could if all this is adopted. So what kind of transfer of capacities is feasible to make it happen within government is one of the questions that we are working on. And what we are applying, learning from our past work at UEZO, is that creating spaces for the responsible officers in government to participate in co-creating and developing capacities, then open space for engagement rather than just plain advocacy. So we are working with the National Institutes of Curriculum Development and the National Institutes of Assessment, which are government institutions, and have gone to the officers that are responsible for working on these pieces and brought them on board as part of the test development panels as a growth school together, so that we are opening this growth community to government and see whether working with government officers, we could rise together to a point of engaging. So this is, I think, a very exciting experiment, but we have seen a lot of development on the conversations that are already happening within the government institution, and looking at a horizon where probably we could leapfrog what is happening in government when capacity is also developed. So I think we will be sharing a lot on what we are learning, but we still have some way to go on how creating and expanding spaces for government officers to participate within this assessment might make and bring around change.
Recording in progress.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Adele, go for it.
So I can't seem to find a way to raise my, oh no, now I see I've been looking for the raise hand button. Anyway, I just wanted to build on what's already been said. And I think from our experience engaging with policymakers, engaging with teachers through the work that we've been doing, I think one thing that I've learned is that everyone wants something that will make their lives as easy as possible, right? Like, so, and this ties back to the question of, are we expecting too much of teachers? Are we adding more things for them to do? Same for policymakers. When we bring social emotional learning to the table, are we adding on an additional burden or additional task that for them seems unnecessary? Or are we trying to help them do the job that they're intended to do? And so I think one key part of this, the narrative, and then in terms of the efforts to improve measurement and improvement of programs focused on social emotional learning, I think that a clever way of going about it would be to think about how to frame it so that it's clear what's in it for the parties involved. So when we talk about, tools for teachers or an intervention focused on social emotional learning that involves teachers, the narrative needs to be, okay, teachers, this is how this could help you in your classroom, right? If you help your children self-regulate better or put in some intervention to help with self-regulation, this is how it could help you organize your classroom better. You have more time that you can spend on instruction, and then you cover the curriculum better, and you get the learning outcomes that you're looking for example. And I think in the longer run that we definitely want to move forward this dialogue or this narrative or messaging around the importance of social emotional learning in itself. But in the short term, I think one quick win that I can see is, again, as I mentioned, kind of framing it as this helps you get to that. Like if this is your ultimate, if academic learning is your outcome and it's going to take time to shift away from that, social emotional learning actually is key to help you get there. So that's one. And then I think the second thought I wanted to share was the other thing that I've learned from the measurement work that I've been doing is that it's really important to communicate that there are different measurement purposes and different measurement goals and different tools aligned to these different measurement purposes and measurement goals. So something that I often see in the work that I do is that teams or stakeholders have a tool that they found that is, exciting and gets you data that they think that would be really interesting, but it's designed for an impact evaluation and it's a tool that they want to implement at scale within a regular monitoring system. And that's just setting things up for failure because while it might be an interesting tool, there won't be the capacity needed to implement the tool at scale in a way that gives you data that you can trust. And chances of it being implemented on a regular basis with some frequency just isn't going to happen. So I think that's another piece that we've been really careful about and thinking about, okay, if this is a smaller program, impact evaluation setting, these are tools that would help there. But when we're thinking about monitoring with governments, that won't work. So what tools can we provide governments to fill that gap?
Awesome, excellent. Adele's gonna get us all into marketing with our, what's the hook? What's the tagline? Awesome stuff. Pauline, do you have any thoughts before we move into a broader Q&A on those two first questions from Danica?
I mean, I'm happy to hear from others. I think the points that everybody have made are absolutely essential. And I think, as Adele was saying, I think it's what we do might depend on who the audience is. And I think that's absolutely vital. For our RISE work, our audience is perhaps more government, and sometimes that's important. And for others, the direct audience is teachers. Obviously, indirectly, our audience is teachers. So I think there's sort of variations. One thing, the reason why I picked up on the word confusion, whether I was understanding it right or wrongly, was, Amy Jo, you might remember when we were first discussing this, we were discussing, there's a huge amount of debate out there. There's all these different tools, and it is actually quite confusing, to be honest. And I think sort of the benefit of a platform like this and a discussion like this is actually moving us beyond this debate about, okay, this tool and that tool, but actually saying, okay, what is it we're trying to achieve? How do we go about it? And how do we get there? Because otherwise we can get a bit stuck in the rut of just debating, well, how are we going to measure it? Is it right to do this or is it right to do that? There's probably no real right or wrong. It's depending on your audience and your purpose, and really benefiting from the work that has already gone on and building on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks so much. I actually want to take this opportunity to ask a question that was in the chat. From the perspective of teachers, what kind of guidance is there available that any of you know of for teachers to assess skills? Sort of the more formative side of the topic. Anyone? And Andy, I think you showed your hand.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is it depends on the context where the teacher lives. In some countries, they are further along in terms of testing and piloting and figuring out kind of what's practical and also what's useful to actually measure, rather than just sort of let's do another survey and, oh, that feels good, but that's not going to change anything in my practice. Versus some countries, they don't have anything on the books, but they have it in words, in stories, in experiences. And so I think the short answer is, please send me an email Bronwyn McGrath, our director of Schools 2030, will send you all of the resources that we have managed to find, and then give context to the context for if there's any particular countries where we are finding relevance from the teachers themselves as they're helping design these rapid assessment tools from their current work.
Awesome, thank you. There's a couple of different ways the question is being asked around, I think it comes from maybe Adele's "what gets measured gets done" tagline. Sort of thinking about how do we avoid that leading to measurement as accountability, as opposed to sort of measurement for knowing how to improve, you know, what's going on in a classroom or in a district, a province, et cetera. I just wondered your thoughts around that, so that we're not setting up holistic skills with sort of high stakes notion, but more thinking about this in a formative frame, in a utility frame as we're moving forward. I see nods. Any hands? Adele, go for it.
So I think Andy Smart first directed this question to me, so I'm happy to take a first stab, and then it'd be great to hear what other panelists have to say as well. But I think this is a crucial question, and one that we've consistently had to balance when communicating with governments and, you know, supporting measurement, but being very careful to make sure that it doesn't cross that line. I think two things. One, that communication is crucial from the very beginning, and that communication of why we're suggesting they measure and for what purpose. I think that needs to be set up very clearly from the beginning, and there needs to be that buy-in. And I think part of that also comes at coming in with a very clear plan of how this data is going to be used. So it's not just, oh, you know, we want you to collect data, or we suggest that you collect data, or we're here to support you to collect data, but to have a full plan of, okay, when we get the data, these are the things that you can do with it. This is how it can be communicated back to stakeholders. This is how it can improve programming. This is how it can feed back into this, you know, rapid evaluation framework, for example. And I think that that's absolutely crucial. I think the other part of it, again, is communicating what tools were developed for and what they weren't developed for. So what they can be used for and what they shouldn't be used for. And this ties back to what I was saying earlier as well, of there being different measurement purposes and measurement goals. And so when we share our early childhood measurement tools, for example, or with Teach, we'll always say these tools were not designed to be high stakes evaluative tools. These tools were not designed to be used within a high stakes environment, and they should not be used for that purpose. Rather, these tools were used for formative or to inform, you know, programming, or to be used as a diagnostic tool to inform policy. And I think that needs to be very clearly, again, communicated along with these tools and along with the planning of any M&E framework. So let me pause there and see other panelists want to chime in too.
Sarah, you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, really just you know, continuing on from what Adele said, I would say, in fact, stop and don't measure unless you are actually going to do something with that data. You know, we see so much measurement, so many hours of testing time, so many resources spent on measuring, and then nothing happens. And so I think, you know, have a very clear idea about what you want to gather information for and what you're going to do with that information. If you're not using the evidence to inform practice, then hold off on measuring. And I also think, you know, that most assessment, we forget, most assessment that happens is informal. It happens in the classroom, and it happens through teachers asking questions of kids. And that is something we need to ensure that teachers are empowered to know that they, as the person standing in the classroom, have got the best, you know, position to find out what students are thinking, how they're learning, how they're able to apply what they know and can do. And that's a very powerful form of assessment, and often one that is, I think, undervalued. And so, you know, if I was talking to government, I would say, you know, think about what teachers are able to do and the recognition that they can have as professionals to make professional judgments based on the evidence that they gather in their own practice.
A quick follow-up to this question is around whether or not any of the interventions and programs that we've talked about today are linked to national exam reform? Or are we saying these are separate examples of assessment outside of those broader reform systems? Just a quick yes or no, I guess, from all the panels, so we get a sense of the answer to that question.
From schools 2030 to be determined, I think we have to be working this year, but with the governments as part of the national advisory committees, that is an ambition.
Amy Jo, is that right to come in?
Well, you have your hand up, go for it. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was on mute somehow.
So a couple of things, just going back to the previous discussion briefly, I think I totally agree we should only collect data if we know why we're collecting it and what we're going to do with it. But I think we also need to be aware that most data on this has been collected in high income contexts. And there's a real danger of transfer of what we know there to the types of contexts that many of us work in. And that's why for us, it's been really important to sort of think about the Ethiopian context and what's relevant there. And the related point in relation to the question you just asked, Amy Jo, I think is that the Ethiopian government itself is keen, and particularly post school closures, to be thinking about how they are sort of including socio-emotional learning as part of their strategy of the whole sort of post-pandemic or during pandemic reforms. And I think as much as exams, I would say it's perhaps more of an issue of thinking about curriculum reform and not so much about what you're teaching, but how you're sort of supporting teachers in delivering the curriculum and so on. So if we see a lot of discussion in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa about competence-based curriculum and what does this mean? How is it being enacted and how is it supporting children's socio-emotional learning and so on? So that's the position I'm coming from on it. Thanks.
Niket, I can't see it, but I'm told your hand is up. Let's finish with you and then we'll open up. I believe Charles has a hand. We'll start with him. Go for it.
Strongly support everything that's been said so far, especially Sarah's point on knowing exactly how the measure would be used, how the data is going to be used. To go back to what Adele was saying as well, it strikes me that we all, and this is probably something that we're already doing, but I don't feel like it's being reflected explicitly. We all have to be communicators. And I don't think there's sufficient resources on how to communicate. How do we communicate this measurement work at different levels? So, and related to that, and this is not specifically to Adele, but maybe to the rest of the panelists and to everyone on this call, is communicating to policymakers and governments about the use of a tool and how it won't be used for high stakes testing is one thing. How do we communicate that to teachers when teachers are in a lot of countries, their salaries are related to their performance? But then we come in and we do another assessment and we say, oh, it's not related at all to your performance. But how do we convince them and actually work with teachers to make sure that they're comfortable with the data that we're collecting in their classrooms? I don't know the answer to that. I struggle with this a lot. And so if any of the other panelists have examples of this or have resources for that, that'd be really useful as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Great point. Need for more investment. So now we'll open it up. I think Charles has his hand up. He can be our first non-panelist to come off mute and ask his question. And then if you'd rather type in your question to chat, feel free. If you'd like to come off mute and raise your hand and come off mute, join the fun, please do so. Charles, take it away.
Thanks, Amy Jo. Hello, everyone. So I would like to volunteer some of the research we've done that may answer some of the questions actually you've had. So the first question was about whether countries, jurisdictions do anything for real about these social emotional learning and 21st century skills. They do not. We've done research with Brookings that's been on the, I sent you the link, that shows that even Singapore and Finland, or even the top-notch champions of PISA, etc., do not have neither pedagogy for teachers nor assessments. So even the champions do not do it, period. So that's number one. Number two, when it comes to countries, competencies, what is the competency of a given country in terms of critical thinking and so on? We've devised an index that shows that, although you'd find some of the traditional OECD PISA champions in some of the cases, You also find very interesting results, like Thailand being #1 worldwide in mindfulness, or Brazil, #1 in courage, or Mexico, #1 in growth mindsets. So that's really interesting because A, it shows that when you have broader whole child, quote unquote, perspectives, well, you know, some people do better than others at various things. Now, of course, this is part of the social fabric of the countries that makes it that way, but it's not to be discarded. Who said that education had to do 100% of the job? You know, society has a role to play in its own structure too. So that's the good news, is that, you know, some countries are doing well at some things, and so they can decide, you know what, if we're not so good at critical thinking as a country, perhaps we should pay attention to this more than courage, where we're already #1, for instance. That also serves to answer the third question partially, which is the overload on the teachers. Part of that overload is to making these hard choices. So if a country is already rating reasonably well in one parameter, then you can say, you know what, teachers, let's not worry about courage. The Brazilian society is doing really well. For whatever reason, just don't touch it, let it be. And now let's focus on the things where we're not doing so well. So teachers ignore courage, focus on the other parameters. Lastly, regarding teachers in particular, I've also shared the third link that shows that you can help this embedding of the competencies with the disciplines, because otherwise it's an overlay that will never take place, right? You know, just too many things to do already, and oh, now you're adding these things. So even the Finlands of the world, they send you a big bunch of PDFs to the teacher and they say, okay, you figure it out. I'm like, no, do I have time really? I'm designing my lesson plan the day or the night before. I have no time to do all of this and become a researcher like you to understand all these things. So first thing you do is to simplify the intersection between the various competencies and the various disciplines. Meaning, don't try to teach leadership out of mathematics. It's just not going to work. It's not very conducive to do that. However, do try to teach critical thinking in mathematics, right? So we have this matrix with, you know, it's a heat map that shows which disciplines are most conducive to teaching which competencies. That already simplified the work of the teacher, so they don't have to worry about 12 parameters. They can worry only about the top 4 parameters. Now it's much more reduced, and if you give them, final point, training, professional development on how to embed these top 4 within math or history or whatever, now it's doable. Now we've simplified their load, and you know, perhaps on another presentation, I'll be able to present what we've been doing in terms of assessments. And I love Sarah's word of evidence rather than assessments. But that's something that actually can be solved with a judicious choice of construct. And Sarah, I'd love to have that conversation with you at some point. That's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. I think that's a lot of food for thought when it comes to feasibility, making things easier for the teachers especially, but also including more of our community, as well as framing it so that it's not an insurmountable, maybe the week before, not the night before, but certainly super useful. Thank you so much. There's another question in the chat that has to do with the correlation between teacher well-being and student SEL outcomes. If any of the panelists have knowledge that this exists or doesn't exist or is developing such a study in a place or 2 or 10, any thoughts on that would be most welcome. Any takers?
Well, as part of the work that I described that we're doing with USAID in the 3 countries, we are trying to establish more of the link between students' social emotional learning and teacher well-being. But I don't think right now, at least to my knowledge, there has been as much of an establishment of that link. I think theoretically, there's a very strong and sound evidence base for that link of teachers' social emotional learning, especially, and kind of children's social emotional learning skills. But once again, a lot of that has come out of high resource context. So I think what we're trying to do is also establish and build that evidence in other contexts with kind of diverse contextual needs.
I think perhaps, Amy, in addition to well-being, you know, when we're thinking about these different attitudes and values around empathy and around reconciling tensions and relationship building. It's also being able to address one's own bias and biases that create a barrier that may not be able to be broken without a self-reflection for and with the teachers. We've collaborated with the Global Center for Pluralism often around these questions around teacher well-being, but also around teachers' pluralistic dispositions. And they often distill this very complex term into 3 questions of who am I, who are you, and who are we? And sometimes we leap too far to the who are you and who are we, particularly as it relates to the social emotional learning domains that ultimately also begin and grow with that relationship that exists in that beautiful place called that classroom. And I think I posted as sort of a quick response of one of our resources that we are piloting still and continuing to strengthen, but that tries to bring a blended set of videos from around the world, but also a concretization in a sense of how might a teacher go about noticing and also enhancing an inclusive learning environment. So I think for us, the well-being, many times when some of us go through these exercises, it's really uncomfortable. And sometimes it's seen as too soft of just give me what's the 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute skill that I can put into an effective classroom context. And that reflective experience is sometimes what's missing most, and also the teacher to understand that they are happy, loved, and also ready to make and create that space for kids to feel happy and loved.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andy. Super important side on the teacher front. Pauline, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah, so slightly different point, not teacher wellbeing specifically, but just from using the World Bank Teach tool that Adele was mentioning earlier, and having done analysis by the gender of the teacher in both Rwanda and Ethiopia, it is interesting to see that for the socio-emotional learning aspect of that tool, but not so much in other aspects of the tool, female teachers are coming out more strongly as supporting the students in the sort of classroom practices in relation to socio-emotional learning. So we could no doubt hypothesize why that might be. And Adele, I don't know whether that's come across in any other countries that have been working on, but sort of quite interesting to see the sort of different characteristics of teachers as well as their own well-being.
So just to say that that's something that I don't remember having popped up so far, but something that I'll definitely want to go back and look into a little bit more. I mean, so we're in the process of, Teach's been rolled out in a few different countries now. We're in the process of pulling together all that data and kind of getting ready to do a deep dive and try to look at some of these characteristics like Pauline has flagged of what could be driving some of the differences of teaching practices that we see in the classroom. And we'd be happy to share back with the group once we have more insights.
And just to say, I can see that Charles has put in the chat about the OECD TALIS scale. To be honest, we looked at that quite carefully for both Ethiopia and Rwanda, and with our colleagues in Ethiopia and Rwanda felt that it wasn't really, a lot of it was not very directly relevant to those types of contexts. There were things that we did bring out, but there were also other tools that were relevant for looking at teacher wellbeing in those contexts. So again, just to repeat myself a bit, but I think the really sort of being clear about what types of tools work in those contexts is really important.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's some of the challenges that we started with in the sort of why, what, why, how is part of the reflected in that statement for sure. Other questions coming from? I don't see questions right now coming from the audience, but how? There is a question about how do we effectively communicate. Nickett was framing it to governments, to teachers, to colleague officials in both governments and partners. Actually, this is about how do we communicate with students about where they stand vis-a-vis their social emotional skills and how they can improve them. Or any thoughts on that from the panelists? Sorry, there's a helicopter. You're getting too much noise. No, it doesn't look maybe like, oh, Andy's got an idea. Go for it.
I'll put in the chat the resources that we've been using with Schools 2030 just at its very, very beginning. And really it's going to launch this September around design thinking and making human-centered design thinking practical in the classroom context. There are many tools and vignettes and small exercises that actually create that dialogue around not only how might our practices be seen as collaborative in terms of improving a culture of care within the classroom, but also the quality learning outcomes, but also how does that classroom identity all work to promote a goal of increasing creativity or demonstrating a sense of leadership. And I think because we believe in the fact that all educators are design thinkers, we feel that some of these tools have helped and will help some of those spaces for communication that have sadly been only perhaps one or unidirectional. And so perhaps maybe some of those resources may be helpful. We're seeing that more and more when we have that kind of co-planning and that kind of co-creation, that communication comes not at the end, but throughout. So I'll just put that in. That might be a good seedling for others to help grow.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for those ideas. I think it may be on the communication to-do list. I see Sarah has just raised her hand. Go for it, Sarah.
I mean, just building on that, I think a really critical element is be consistent. You know, the messaging of what we're often doing is saying to students, I want you to be a critical thinker, but when they exhibit critical thinking, it's like, no, it's not the right time, or you're not doing it about the right thing. You know, if we want kids to be curious, we have to let them be curious. We have to give them space to be curious, permission to be curious. As teachers, we need to support teachers to model curiosity. So we need to have that consistent messaging, setting expectations for the entire ecosystem that students are in, and not ask students to do something that actually is going to go against the grain.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I do feel like it's getting time. We're getting close to time. And I do want to, John, you have your hand up. I can't see your hand. I'm so sorry. I don't know that my Zoom is working well. Go ahead, John.
No problem. We are thinking that the fact that we are going to conduct a household assessment, that connecting this to the parents and the home milieu may work better in getting further from the high-stake examinations that are connected with competencies. That you are not passing or failing, because that's often the narrative within the school milieu. But at home, one may be able to link this more to life, to competencies that actually are not limited to schooling, but are for throughout life. So we will attempt a simple tool for instant feedback at the household level, as a conversation starter with adolescents and their parents and community members on what these competencies mean and their importance even within their context. So we will be sharing lessons, and if anyone has literature around this, would be very happy to learn from them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think on the topic of links in general, there's so many that look so useful in the chat. Please, while we're wrapping up, write your email into the chat, because then we'll be able to access everyone who maybe didn't come in through the registration, because I think that at one point we had 100 people in this call, which is fantastic. And we want to be sure to be able to continue the conversation, share these links for sure, as well as the recording that Donica has been so lovely in organizing, and we'll be able to reference back into this. So while I'm just sort of saying a few words to wrap up, put in everybody who's participating, not just the panelists who I see are popping up, but everyone participating. Please do put in your emails so that we can get a list of all these fantastic links out to you so it doesn't go away when a final few reflections, and then I'll hand over to Danica if she would like to as well. I think for me, a key theme today is ecosystem. This is about holistic skills, but it's also about thinking where you are, how you're doing it, the sort of the holism of not just the skills, but of the participants, be they the teachers, be they the school leadership, the district and province and government affiliates above it, as well as the families and the communities and the aunties and the uncles, who are all thinking, yes, absolutely literacy and numeracy, but not only, because we don't want children just to learn some ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. We want them to thrive. And that link, I think, is something that everyone here is agreeing is not just important, but essential. It makes everything more effective. While at the same time, thinking, how does this not become overwhelming and everything? How does it become feasible and affordable? And for me, like what I've learned since I joined the Lego Foundation about 18 months ago, is that surprisingly, something very fun, play, is one of the answers. And learning more about how that works, how play looks like in terms of exploration, in terms of iteration, in terms of following your curiosity, is really an exciting avenue for us. And I think for this idea of holistic skills and the ways that the whole ecosystem is paying attention, and the whole ecosystem can, yes, be playful and be measured, which sometimes seems like it's serious versus not serious, but actually I think it's fun to measure. So that's just me. I do believe that there are some linkages and some agency and some energy around this that certainly Lego Foundation brings through the play, but mainly also is important for the children and the teachers and the parents in very, very local context. So I want to leave my piece there. Danica, invite you to say just a few final words while we have a couple of more minutes.
Yes, thanks so much, Amy Jo. And let me just extend a huge thanks to all of the panelists and everyone who joined us. It's amazing that we had over 100 people. I think it's a huge testament to the fact that this is an incredibly timely and pressing issue to be focusing on. So I'd say my word here would be momentum. I'm just really excited that we have such a wonderful community coming together to think very pragmatically. It's not really theoretical anymore. We're not talking about only theories and concepts. We're really digging deep into, I think, the how. So that makes me really excited and really motivated for us as a foundation to be supporting a lot of these efforts and to be focusing on how to move this discourse forward and to make sure that we're aligning and making progress on these issues. And this is the time to do it, especially as countries are opening up. There'll be lots of questions on the part of governments and teachers and students themselves of what's next and how do we build better. So I'm really excited that we're coming together, and thank you all. I know today is the first day of GP side event session, so we had the privilege and the advantage of coming in kind of first on this one. So thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope to be able to have more of this, and we'll be thinking together with Lego and others, hopefully, about how to move this conversation forward over the next months and years. So thank you all so much. And we'll be sharing, as Amy Jo said, we'll be sharing the recording and the key takeaways from the session with you all.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.